Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving into some surprisingly intense slices of history you definitely wouldn't want to live through. From the strict codes of honor in feudal Japan, to the bold naval tactics of Artemisia of Korea. Ancient sky watchers predicting eclipses and the painful truths behind America's westward expansion. This episode has it all. If you enjoy fascinating, lesser-known stories that make you grateful for modern life, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more, and turn on the notification bell. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which historical period from today's video you think you'd survive. Or not. Let's get into it and prepare to be glad you weren't born centuries earlier. Let's start with feudal Japan, a place where your fate was decided the moment you were born. You couldn't just work your way up or switch jobs. If you were born a peasant, that was your destiny. If you were born a samurai, your life was ruled by an unforgiving code called Bushidō. That sounds honorable in theory, but in practice, it was relentless. Bushidō demanded absolute loyalty, poetic expression, physical perfection, and moral purity. Mess up, and you weren't just reprimanded, you could be forced to commit ritual suicide. Imagine living every day with the pressure that one wrong move could end in public disgrace or death. Peasants didn't have it any easier. Their days began before the sun came up and didn't end until well after dark. They worked ankle-deep in water, planting rice under the scorching sun, all while knowing that a chunk of everything they grew would be taken as tax. And if the harvest was bad, tough luck. Starvation wasn't just a possibility, it was common. Worse still, if authorities thought you were hiding part of your harvest to feed your family, you could be executed. Think about that. Trying to survive could get you killed. Hygiene and social behavior were no joke either. You started your day by pouring freezing well water over your face and hands, no soap. If you were lucky, you might have access to a communal bath, but that wasn't exactly private or clean. Teeth were scrubbed with salt or twigs. Clothes had to be aired out regularly, and nails had to be kept trimmed and clean. And apologies, they were like theatrical performances. You had to bow deeply, sometimes cry, and speak in carefully chosen words, often poetic ones. A wrong word or a half-hearted gesture wasn't just rude, it could be seen as defiant. Now let's shift from Japan to one of history's most overlooked legends, Artemisia of Korea. Picture this 480 BCE during the Persian invasion of Greece. Xerxes, the king of Persia, has assembled one of the largest armies the world has ever seen. Among his commanders is Artemisia, a Greek woman leading 5 ships into one of the most important naval battles in ancient history. That's right, a woman commanding warships in a time when most women weren't even allowed near a battlefield. She didn't just show up to look good on a roster. She fought. She advised Xerxes himself, and even disobeyed orders when she knew it would save lives. During the Battle of Salamis, when things went south, she made a daring move. She rammed one of her own allied Persian ships to escape a Greek pursuit. That trick made it look like she was on the Greek side, so the enemy let her go. Xerxes, watching from a cliffside, thought she had just taken down a Greek ship. He allegedly said, "My men have become women, and my women men." She not only survived the war, but gained even more trust from the Persian king. From warships to stargazing, we now travel even further back in time to when astronomy began, not as science, but as survival. Before telescopes or charts, ancient people relied on the sky to tell them when to plant, harvest, and pray. The Sumerians were pioneers. Around 3000 BCE, they tracked lunar cycles and created a base 60 numbering system. Why is that important? Because we still use it today for 60-minute hours and 360-degree circles. They didn't just look at the stars. They built entire belief systems and calendars around them. Then came the Babylonians. They took it to the next level, recording planetary positions on clay tablets. These weren't just observations, they were predictions. They could forecast eclipses using something called the Saros cycle. Think about that. Without computers or calculators, they figured out the rhythm of the heavens. And the Egyptians, they watched for the star Sirius. Its rising signaled the annual flooding of the Nile, which meant fertile land and food. Miss that signal, and entire civilizations could starve. Now, fast forward to 1803, America has just bought the Louisiana Territory, doubling its size. But with that expansion came consequences. Treaties with Native American tribes were signed, yes, but many were based on deception or pressure. The U.S. wanted land, and it would do whatever it took to get it. Sometimes that meant offering deals that were never honored. Other times, it meant military force. It's easy to think of that era as a time of heroic pioneers, but there was a darker side. Native communities were uprooted sometimes with just days' notice. Diseases brought by settlers tore through populations with no immunity. Food sources were destroyed. Tribes that had lived on the same land for generations were forced to move or vanish. And these weren't just isolated events. This pattern of removal, manipulation, and erasure set the tone for how Native American nations would be treated for centuries. Even today, the legal battles over land rights and tribal sovereignty trace back to broken promises made during this era of expansion. So what ties all these stories together? It's the raw truth that history isn't just about kings' battles or inventions. It's about ordinary people. People like you and me, trying to survive systems they didn't choose. Whether it's a peasant in feudal Japan, a female admiral in ancient Greece, a sky watcher decoding the cosmos in Mesopotamia, or an indigenous elder watching their homeland disappear, these are human stories. And often they're stories of resilience under pressure. Looking back helps us appreciate what we have today. We have rights choices and comforts most people throughout history couldn't even dream of. But it also reminds us that progress didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without struggle. So, if you've made it this far, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like the video if you learned something new. Subscribe so you never miss another story, and comment below. Which of these historical moments struck you the most? And why would you survive a day in feudal Japan? Would you dare sail into battle like Artemisia? Until next time, stay curious, stay thoughtful, and stay grateful. You weren't born in 480 BCE. But the pressure in feudal Japan didn't stop at birth status or backbreaking labor. It extended deep into your daily behavior, especially if you were born a samurai. Let's talk about what it actually meant to live under the rule of Bushidō, the way of the warrior. We often romanticize samurai in pop culture, stoic swordsmen in polished armor, cutting down enemies in choreographed duels. But the reality? It was a full-time psychological gauntlet. Being a samurai wasn't just about fighting, it was about being. Every step, word, and gesture had to reflect your honor. Your back had to be straight, your gaze level, your speech precise. Too casual, and you were seen as arrogant. Too humble, and you might seem cowardly. There was no space to simply exist, you were always performing. Now imagine living in a world where how you bowed could determine your reputation. A samurai's bow wasn't just a polite nod. It had to be deep enough to show respect, but not so deep that it looked desperate. If you were apologizing, it had to be a full kneel with your forehead touching the floor, and even that might not be enough. A simple apology could turn into a formal ritual involving witnesses' poetry, and sometimes even cutting off a lock of your own hair as a symbolic act of shame. And if your shame ran deep enough, there was always seppuku, ritual suicide. It was considered a way to reclaim lost honor, to wipe your slate clean with your own blood. But this wasn't just some dramatic gesture. It involved dressing in white, composing a final death poem, and making a precise abdominal cut before an appointed second, usually a close friend, decapitated you. The goal was to die beautifully with dignity. That's how deeply the fear of dishonor was embedded in samurai life. The expectation wasn't just bravery in battle, it was perfection in death. Let's zoom in on a typical samurai morning. The day might begin at sunrise with zazen, or seated meditation, often in total silence. You'd sit perfectly still for as long as an hour, disciplining your mind. Afterward, you'd perform a series of grooming tasks, nothing luxurious, but everything had to be immaculate. Your kimono had to be folded just right. Your sword, your most sacred possession, had to be cleaned, polished, and displayed correctly. There were entire manuals on how to care for your blade, and some samurai believed the spirit of their ancestors lived within it. Breakfast. Likely a small bowl of rice, maybe miso soup if you were lucky. Meals weren't times of joy or chatter. They were often silent, orderly, and quick. Conversation was sparse and humor was rare. You were supposed to eat just enough to sustain your body no more. Excess was a sign of moral weakness. Training came next. A samurai was expected to train every single day, regardless of age or rank. That meant hours of sword practice, archery, horseback riding, and later in the Edo period, even calligraphy and literature. Mastery wasn't optional, it was your duty. And here's something wild: many samurai also practiced death rehearsal. That's right, imagining your own death was a form of mental preparation. Some would write detailed death poems or letters to loved ones as part of a daily routine. The goal: to remind yourself that death could come at any moment, and when it did, you had to meet it with composure. There was no crying, no begging, only stillness and grace. This brings us to another intense aspect of samurai culture: stoicism. Emotions weren't denied, but they had to be mastered. Grief, express it in a haiku. Fear, channel it into silence. A samurai didn't scream or panic, even in pain. There are stories of warriors enduring fatal wounds and using their final breaths to apologize for staining their armor with blood. That level of control wasn't just respected, it was expected. And women of the samurai class. Their lives were just as restricted, though in different ways. They were trained from a young age in etiquette, house management, and in some cases, martial arts. Carrying a small dagger called a kaiken samurai, women were expected to protect their honor, sometimes even through suicide, if they were dishonored or if their husbands fell in battle. Their role wasn't ornamental. They were the keepers of the household, the educators of the next generation of samurai. And in emergencies, they could defend the home with deadly force. Even children weren't spared the weight of Bushidō. Boys were taught to wield wooden swords by age 5. By their early teens, they were composing death poems and learning the art of war. Crying was discouraged, and personal expression had to be channeled through poetry, painting, or music, always within strict boundaries. A single misstep could shame not just you, but your entire lineage. This constant surveillance, both self-imposed and social, created a world where appearances were everything. Social events became arenas for judgment. The way you tied your sash, the way you arranged your tea set, even how you sat on a mat, all of it was scrutinized. You were never truly alone. Even in solitude, you carried the weight of your ancestors' expectations and your descendants' futures. And what if you weren't born a samurai, but instead a ronin, a masterless warrior that was even worse? Without a lord to serve you, were considered unstable, dishonorable, and potentially dangerous. Many ronin became mercenaries or fell into poverty. Others tried to maintain the code, but without the structure of a clan or patron, they were adrift in a society that no longer had a place for them. So while the samurai class may look glamorous from afar, It was a life defined by endless rules, constant pressure, and very little room for error or individuality. You didn't just live under Bushidō, you performed it every minute of every day until your last breath. And that's the lesson here. We think of discipline and honor as noble traits, and they are, but when they're enforced without compassion, they can become prisons. The samurai world was one of beauty, strength, and philosophy. Yes, but it was also one of unrelenting pressure, psychological burden, and emotional suppression. Coming up next, we'll turn from the rigid structures of samurai life to the resilience of those working the rice fields. Because if you thought warriors had it rough, wait till you hear what peasants endured just to survive. Stick around. If samurai lived under crushing pressure to perform perfection, then peasants lived under something even more brutal, the pressure to survive. And unlike the samurai, they didn't have swords, land, or poetry. They had mud, sweat, and the constant threat of starvation or execution. Welcome to the world of feudal Japanese peasants, where life wasn't just hard, it was almost impossible. Let's set the scene. You're born into a rice farming family. Your hands are calloused by age 7. Your back aches by 12. There are no schools, no playtime, no dreams of becoming anything other than what your parents were. Farming isn't a career, it's a sentence. Your mornings start before the sun rises. There's no alarm clock, just the sound of roosters' wind rustling the thatched roof, and maybe your grandmother coughing from years of smoke exposure. You splash freezing well water on your face, no soap, no towel, and shove a ball of leftover rice into your mouth if you're lucky. Then it's out to the paddies. Working in a rice paddy is not a peaceful pastoral scene. It's dirty, exhausting, and dangerous. You stand ankle or even knee-deep in stagnant water under a scorching sun, planting each stalk of rice by hand. The mud sucks at your feet, leeches crawl up your legs, and mosquitoes swarm in clouds. Your back is bent all day, your fingers numb from repetitive movement. And you do this every day 12, sometimes 14 hours, just to produce a crop that you don't even get to keep. Because here's the kicker. Most of your rice goes to the government. You see, feudal Japan operated under a rice tax system. It didn't matter how good or bad your harvest was. You were expected to meet a fixed quota. Didn't meet it. You were punished. Tried to hide a portion to feed your family. That was treason. And the punishment wasn't just a fine, it could be execution. That's not dramatic exaggeration. Families were beheaded or publicly shamed for trying to survive. And still, every season, countless peasants risked it anyway, because the alternative was starvation. Think about the stress of that. You work all year, knowing that the weather pests, floods, or droughts could destroy everything, and yet the taxman still shows up expecting his share. And he doesn't want excuses. He wants grain, real tangible sacks of rice. If you don't have them, your land can be confiscated, your house burned, your family scattered, and you don't get to vent. There's no peasant union, no protest, no uprising. Speaking against your lord, or even appearing disrespectful, could get you flogged or worse. The best you could hope for was to go unnoticed. Silence was survival. So you kept your head down, literally and figuratively. You bowed to everyone above you. You spoke in humble tones. You avoided eye contact with samurai. Even your clothes signaled your inferiority, simple earth-colored garments made from hemp or rough cotton, while the upper classes wore silk embroidered with status symbols. If you dressed too well, you might be accused of theft or arrogance. Your house wasn't really a house, it was a shack. Most peasant homes were one-room structures made from wood and mud, with no insulation, no windows, and no privacy. The roof was thatch easily damaged by wind or fire. When it rained, the floor turned to mush. When it was cold, you shivered under thin blankets. And when there was a fire, it spread fast. Villages could burn to the ground in minutes, and there were no firefighters coming to help. You rebuilt with your own hands, assuming you had the materials. And what about medical care? There wasn't any. A bad cut could get infected. A fever could kill a child. Women gave birth at home, often alone, with no painkillers and no help unless a midwife was nearby. If the child survived, they were immediately folded into the labor force. Childhood wasn't a time of innocence. It was unpaid labor in miniature. Food was minimal. On good days, you had rice, maybe some pickled vegetables. On bad days, it was millet or barley, cheap grains with less flavor and fewer calories. Meat was rare. Fish, if you lived near water, was a treat. And everything had to be rationed. Every grain mattered. You didn't throw food away ever. Even burned rice or spoiled pickles were eaten because wasting food was unthinkable. And let's not forget clothing. You didn't have a wardrobe, you had a pair of clothes. One for working, one for sleeping. They were patched again and again until they were more thread than fabric. If you were lucky, you got a new garment every couple of years. Shoes. Often straw sandals that disintegrated in the mud. In winter, you stuffed your sleeves with straw to stay warm. Despite all this, there was a strange kind of order to peasant life. Villages were tight-knit. Families worked together. Religious festivals offered brief moments of joy, colorful processions, paper lantern songs, and maybe a little sake if someone could spare it. These festivals weren't just entertainment, they were psychological survival. They reminded people that they were part of something larger, that they weren't completely forgotten. And within this brutally hard life, there were acts of quiet rebellion. Families found clever ways to hide small caches of food. Peasants created coded songs and stories that mocked the ruling class without being obvious. Humor, music, and storytelling became tools of endurance. But the truth remained. Peasants were expendable in the eyes of the elite. Their lives were labor. Their value was measured in how much they could produce. If they died of exhaustion, malnutrition, or cold, there were more where they came from. It's hard to imagine a life with so little freedom, so little comfort, and so little security. But that was the norm for millions of people across centuries. And the next time you hear someone wax poetic about traditional Japanese life, remember that behind the serene paintings of rice fields and cherry blossoms were people whose lives were defined by suffering, resilience, and survival. So, while the samurai lived in a psychological prison of honor, the peasants lived in a physical one, surrounded by mud hunger and fear. Their strength wasn't in ritual or reputation, it was in endurance. The strength to keep going season after season with no promise of reward. Just the hope that maybe, just maybe, their children might live a slightly better life. Coming up next, not everyone in feudal Japan wielded a sword or a hoe. Some sharpened words instead. Stay tuned as we explore the life of artisans and merchants, those who built beauty and brokered power from the shadows. If peasants held up society with their labor and samurai guarded it with their swords, then artisans and merchants kept it moving with their hands and minds. And yet, ironically, they were often considered the lowest of the low. That's right, even lower than peasants. It might sound backward. After all, artisans made everything from roof tiles to temple bells to the lacquered armor samurai wore with pride. Merchants kept cities alive, bartering rice, importing silks, supplying candles and ink and tea leaves. Without them, life in feudal Japan would have ground to a halt. And still, socially, they were barely tolerated. Why? Because of Confucian philosophy, which influenced Japanese society deeply. According to that worldview, value came from production, from working the land, or serving the state. Since merchants didn't create anything themselves, but instead profited from the labor of others, they were seen as parasitic. Artisans fared slightly better, they at least worked with their hands, but they still didn't grow food or die in war, so they were placed below both samurai and peasants. But here's where things get interesting. Despite their low status, artisans and merchants often lived better lives than those technically above them. Especially in the Edo period, as Japan urbanized cities like Edo, modern-day Tokyo, Osaka, and Kyoto exploded with activity. With more people came more demand for food, clothes, furniture, ink, musical instruments, religious artifacts, toys, you name it. Someone had to make it. Someone had to sell it. That's where artisans and merchants stepped in. Let's talk about artisans first. These weren't just random hobbyists with a hammer. Artisans in Japan trained for years, sometimes decades, to perfect a single craft. A swordsmith might spend his entire life learning how to temper steel just right. A potter could dedicate themselves to perfecting a specific glaze passed down through generations. Even a fan maker might specialize in a single folding technique. Precision and tradition were everything. Artisan workshops were usually small and family-run. Skills were passed from parent to child, often with fierce secrecy. A father might teach only one of his sons the full method, just in case the others turned traitor or married into another trade family. That's how valuable these techniques were. And it wasn't about mass production. It was about mastery. Creating fewer items, but making them perfect. These workshops lined the edges of castles and temple towns. If you needed a sword, polished a scroll mounted, or get a sandals repaired, the artisan district was your go-to. Some even became legendary. Tea ceremony masters would commission specific ceramicists. Daimyos, the regional lords, might patronize a particular family of armorers. And if you became known for your skill, that fame could last centuries. Some artisan lineages still exist today, producing goods using the same techniques as their ancestors did 400 years ago. But for all their talent, artisans weren't rich. They were respected within their circles, yes, but still expected to show deference to everyone above them. A potter might spend months perfecting a ceremonial tea bowl, only to watch it be scrutinized by a noble who knew nothing of pottery. And if the noble didn't like it, too bad. Your livelihood might depend on that reaction. Then came the merchants, arguably the most complicated class of all. Merchants were the middlemen of Japan. They ran sake shops, pawn shops, inns, silk trading posts, rice markets, and tool shops. They transported goods between regions, negotiated contracts, and extended credit. And although they were officially ranked dead last on the social ladder, in many cases, they were quietly the richest people in town. But their wealth couldn't be obvious. That was the catch. Sumptuary laws, a fancy way of saying status-based fashion rules, restricted what merchants could wear or display. You couldn't flaunt expensive silks, host flashy parties, or ride in palanquins like a samurai. So they developed what came to be known as the aesthetic of iki, refined understatement. You didn't show off with bright colors. You showed off with subtlety. A perfect crease in a gray kimono. A hidden tattoo that only close friends might glimpse. A tea set made from rare materials but kept locked away unless someone really got it. In private, many merchant families lived lavishly. They had spacious homes, private gardens, libraries, and art collections. Their daughters were educated. Their sons were taught to navigate complex financial systems. And when samurai fell into debt, as many did guess who they came crawling to merchants. That created a strange power dynamic. On paper, samurai held all the status. But in practice, merchants held the money. And in a society where rice could be traded like currency, that money talked louder than any title. Over time, some wealthy merchant families began to influence politics from the shadows. They couldn't hold office, but they could sponsor infrastructure fund temples or support artists who would go on to shape national culture. The rise of kabuki theater, for example, was fueled largely by merchant-class support. So while their names rarely appeared in official records, their fingerprints were everywhere. Still, the class divide remained sharp. A merchant could never legally become a samurai. Their children couldn't attend elite martial academies. They couldn't marry into noble families, at least not officially. But loopholes existed. Adopted heirs, arranged marriages, secret sponsorships. In a society that publicly resisted change, the merchant class became experts at working around the rules. And through it all, both artisans and merchants endured social invisibility. They propped up the economy, decorated the culture, and funded entire districts, but they were expected to stay humble, quiet, and obedient. It's like building a house and then being told you're not allowed to live in it. But there's something undeniably compelling about them. They represent resilience through ingenuity. Where peasants survived through labor and samurai through discipline, artisans and merchants survived through skill, strategy, and style. They knew the game was rigged, and they played it anyway. So the next time you see a beautifully crafted katana or sip green tea from a delicate ceramic bowl, remember that didn't come from a noble's hand. It came from a back alley workshop, from a man who probably never raised his voice, but whose legacy whispers through centuries. Coming up next. If the streets of Edo buzzed with artisans and merchants by day, then by night they shimmered with something entirely different: entertainment, elegance, and escape. Stick around as we explore the floating world of courtesans, geishas, and the pleasures of the Forbidden City. If artisans built beauty with their hands and merchants moved wealth in whispers, then the floating world was where both spent their nights chasing elegance, escape, and illusion. In Japanese, it was called ukiyo, literally the floating world. But this wasn't about drifting aimlessly. It was about living for the moment, escaping the burdens of daily life, and indulging in everything society tried to suppress by day. And nowhere was this world more alive than in the pleasure districts of Edo, Kyoto, and Osaka. These weren't just red light zones or taverns. They were entire neighborhoods sealed off by walls and gates where time felt like it stopped. Inside, you'd find glowing lanterns, the sound of shamisen music echoing down narrow lanes, paper fans fluttering, and laughter slipping from behind silk curtains. At the heart of it all were the geisha, the most misunderstood figures in Japanese history. Let's clear something up. Right away, geisha were not prostitutes. They were artists, performers, storytellers. They trained for years to master instruments, poetry, conversation, dance, and etiquette. A geisha's job was to entertain through refinement, not sex. Think of them as the ultimate social conductors, reading the room, guiding the mood, and making elite men feel heard, respected, even elevated. And becoming a geisha wasn't easy. Girls were often apprenticed in their early teens, moving into an okiya, a geisha house where they trained under strict discipline. They learned how to walk without sound laugh, without baring teeth bow, at the exact angle appropriate to a guest's rank, and hold a teacup with perfect grace. Their white makeup, intricate hairstyles, and layered kimonos weren't just fashion. They were part of a visual language that signaled rank, experience, and season. Even the height of the sandal they wore told you if she was a full geisha or still an apprentice, called a maiko. But geisha weren't the only stars of the night. There were also courtesans, known as oiran. Unlike geisha, courtesans were high-ranking sex workers, but that description doesn't do them justice. An oiran was an icon. She was trained in conversation, calligraphy, fashion, tea ceremony, and even martial arts. Her outfits could weigh over 40 pounds, adorned with embroidered dragon's phoenixes or seasonal flowers, and her hair might take hours to style. Walking in those towering wooden clogs wasn't just hard, it was a spectacle. Courtesans didn't just sell intimacy, they sold fantasy. And the cost of spending a single night with one astronomical. You couldn't just pay your way in either. You had to court her. Send gifts, write letters, prove your worth. Sometimes it took months before an Oiran would agree to meet you privately. In a world where everything was fast, loud, and restricted, she offered something rare: attention, artistry, and control. These courtesans lived in yukaku-licensed pleasure quarters like Yoshiwara in Edo Shimabara in Kyoto or Shinmachi in Osaka. These districts were heavily regulated, surrounded by gates and lit by paper lanterns that swayed like fireflies in the night. Inside, it wasn't just about sex. It was about theater. The architecture was ornate, the food exquisite. Musicians played on street corners. Artists sketched the scene. Writers came for inspiration. It was a full-blown cultural zone, a melting pot of urban sophistication where rules bent and roles blurred. And that's what made the floating world both alluring and dangerous. You see, in the rest of Japan, everything was rigid. Your role was defined. You bowed to superiors. You never spoke out of turn. But in the floating world, samurai bowed to geisha. Rich merchants begged for a courtesan's favor. Power was flipped on its head. For one night, the usual rules didn't apply. And that's why so many people, especially men of status, were drawn to it. They craved the relief, the performance, the sense of escape. But it came at a cost. Men bankrupted themselves chasing these illusions. They sold family heirlooms borrowed from merchants, even embezzled from lords just to afford another visit. Some lost everything. Others became obsessed, blurring the line between reality and fantasy. And when the money dried up, the floating world floated away without apology. Even for the women inside, the glamour came with pain. While some geisha and courtesans found fame and influence, most lived difficult lives. They were bound by contracts heavily monitored and subject to fierce competition. Illness was common. So was isolation. Retirement came early, sometimes by age 30, and the transition to a new life outside the pleasure district wasn't always kind. But despite all that, many found power within the system. Some geisha became political liaisons, passing messages between factions. Others invested their earnings, opened their own tea houses, or mentored future generations. Some courtesans gained fame that rivaled movie stars today, immortalized in woodblock prints and poems, their names whispered like legends. And in doing so, they carved out a kind of autonomy unheard of for women elsewhere in feudal society. Culturally, the floating world left a huge mark. It gave rise to ukiyo-e, those famous woodblock prints that show geisha in colorful robes, kabuki actors, frozen mid-pose, and courtesans strolling under cherry blossoms. These prints weren't just art, they were like the Instagram of the Edo period. They shaped taste-inspired fashion and fueled the public's obsession with the glamorous underbelly of their own society. Even today, echoes of the floating world remain. Geisha still perform in Kyoto. Ukiyo-e prints hang in museums across the world. And that concept of living beautifully, briefly, and fully, that ukiyo spirit still resonates with anyone who's ever craved escape, performance, or passion. So if peasants endured, samurai obeyed, artisans crafted, and merchants strategized, then those who lived in the floating world dared. They danced between structure and freedom. They played roles, told stories, and sold the illusion that for a nightlife could be perfect. Coming up next, while the cities sparkled, Japan's countryside held its own quiet power shrines, rituals, ancestral worship, and the unseen spiritual codes that governed daily life. Let's step away from the bright lights and into the sacred as we explore the spiritual spine of feudal Japan. As the floating world shimmered in the cities, ephemeral, luxurious, alive, the countryside pulsed with something deeper. Stillness, reverence, spirit. While merchants chased silver and samurai upheld honor, millions of Japanese people were shaped by something more ancient, more invisible faith. Not in one god, not even in one religion, but in a spiritual system that blended Shinto Buddhism and ancestral worship into a way of life. In feudal Japan, spirituality wasn't confined to temples or holidays. It was woven into every step, every meal, every season. You didn't practice religion once a week. You lived it. From the moment you awoke, you were immersed in invisible forces. Spirits of the land, whispers of ancestors, rhythms of nature. Let's begin with Shinto, the native belief system of Japan. Unlike Western religions, Shinto didn't revolve around commandments or a central deity. It was more like a worldview. Everything rocks, rivers. Wind trees was inhabited by kami or spirits. Kami weren't gods in the traditional sense. Some were mighty forces like the sun goddess Amaterasu. Others were humble spirits of a small waterfall or even a kitchen fire. This belief shaped how people moved through the world. You didn't just walk through a forest, you walked through sacred ground. You didn't build without asking permission from the land. Before planting rice, farmers held ceremonies to honor the kami of the soil. Before launching a boat, fishermen offered sake to the spirit of the sea. It was respect, not fear, and understanding that the world was alive, and your job was to live in harmony with it. That harmony extended into the home where ancestral worship took root. In every household there was a small altar called a butsudan, or kamedana, where incense was lit, food was offered, and prayers were whispered. These weren't dramatic rituals. They were daily habits. A bit of rice placed for a grandfather who'd passed. A bow. A thank you. Death in this world wasn't the end. Ancestors stayed close, watching, guiding, expecting your best behavior. And if you misbehaved, it wasn't just your reputation you risked, it was your family's honor, even in the afterlife. That's a powerful incentive to walk a careful path. But spiritual life didn't stop at the home. Shrines and temples dotted the countryside like stars in a rural sky. Shinto shrines were usually marked by torii gates, those elegant red arches that signaled the transition from the human world to the divine. Step through and the rules changed. Voices lowered. Shoes came off. Hands clapped twice to summon the kami. Coins were tossed. Wishes whispered. Bells rung. These rituals might seem small, but they carried deep meaning. A shrine wasn't just a place to pray, it was a place to connect. To nature. To time. To forces older than any emperor or shogun. Then there was Buddhism, which had arrived centuries earlier from China and Korea, and by the feudal era had deeply merged with Japanese identity. If Shinto honored nature's spirit, Buddhism taught detachment from suffering, self-awareness, and the cycle of rebirth. Samurai practiced Zen meditation. Farmers chanted sutras. Monks wandered from village to village, offering blessings, healing, and sometimes even medical care. Buddhist temples, often built near mountains or springs, were centers of community life. They hosted festivals, taught children, held funerals, and served as neutral ground in times of conflict. The temple bell, deep, resonant, slow, was the sound of both celebration and mourning. It told you when someone had died, when a new season had begun, when it was time to reflect. And reflect they did. Feudal Japan was a time of constant struggle, war, famine, disease. People needed comfort. They needed meaning. Buddhism provided that. It taught that suffering was part of life, but also that peace was possible through mindfulness, compassion, and letting go of attachment. For people with no control over their social class, political fate, or even food security, that message resonated deeply. Seasonal festivals blended all three threads: Shinto Buddhism and ancestral worship into vivid rituals. In spring, cherry blossoms weren't just admired, they were a reminder of impermanence, a Buddhist concept. In summer, the Obon festival honored the spirits of the dead, welcoming ancestors back with lanterns dancing and offerings. In autumn, harvest festivals thanked the rites kami. In winter, bells were rung 108 times to cleanse the soul of earthly desires. Even everyday actions had spiritual undertones. Sweeping your floor wasn't just cleaning, was clearing bad energy. Preparing food was a form of prayer. The placement of objects in your home followed invisible rules of balance, order, and respect for spirit. It was ritualized living, not in a strict or oppressive way, but in a way that brought awareness to even the smallest gestures. For women, spiritual life often provided rare moments of agency. While their social roles were restricted, many found respect and leadership in religious practice. Some became maiko, or shrine maidens, conducting ceremonies, dancing, and interpreting divine messages. Others became nuns, devoting their lives to prayer and community service. Religion gave them a voice when society often didn't, and for the sick, the outcast, the unlucky shrines and temples offered hope. People traveled days to reach a sacred spring said to cure illness. Families carried their infants to temples to be blessed. Farmers left charms on trees. Samurai burned incense before battle. Everyone, regardless of class, turned to spirit when the world became too heavy. But there was also fear. Belief in yokai, supernatural creatures, was widespread. Mischievous fox spirits, vengeful ghosts, hungry demons. These weren't bedtime stories. They were cautionary tales with real consequences. Step on sacred ground disrespectfully, and you might invite a curse. Die with hatred in your heart, and you might return as a restless spirit. The supernatural was everywhere, not as fantasy, but as potential reality. This blend of faiths, natural, ancestral, cosmic, didn't just give people meaning. It shaped how they moved, spoke, built, and believed. The rituals created a rhythm. The shrines gave a compass. The spirits gave a presence that made even the loneliest places feel inhabited. And so, in feudal Japan, spirituality wasn't something you chose. It was something you breathed. Every bow, every offering, every whispered name into the smoke of incense was a reminder you were part of something bigger, something older, something sacred. Coming up next, from the sacred to the scholarly, let's explore how learning worked in feudal Japan. Who got educated, what they studied, and how schools helped shape the minds behind. The sword, scrolls, and shops of a deeply layered society. While the rhythm of rural shrines and temple bells shaped the soul of feudal Japan, it was education, quiet, disciplined, deliberate, that shaped its mind. After all, belief alone doesn't build a society. It needs scribes, thinkers, record keepers, and strategists. But in a country so rigidly defined by status, who got to learn and what they were allowed to learn was anything but equal. Let's start at the top. The samurai class. We tend to think of samurai as just warriors, but by the Edo period, they were often more bureaucrat than battlefield hero. The constant civil wars of earlier centuries had given way to relative peace under Tokugawa rule, and with fewer wars to fight, samurai became the administrators, tax collectors, and city officials of Japan, and for that role, they needed education. Samurai children, especially boys, were enrolled in terrakoya, literally temple schools. These schools were originally run by Buddhist temples, but by the 18th century, many had become secular, run by samurai or literate townspeople. There, students learned reading, writing, calligraphy, arithmetic, and Confucian ethics. The focus wasn't just on knowledge, it was on moral development, loyalty, respect, and self-control. Imagine this. You're 7 years old, the child of a mid-ranking samurai. Your day begins with bowing to your teacher, cleaning the classroom floor with your sleeves, and reciting Chinese maxims that emphasize virtue and hierarchy. Lessons are copied endlessly with a brush and ink. Perfection is the expectation. Sloppy strokes aren't just a technical failure, they're a moral one. And then there's the death poem. By their teenage years, many samurai boys were expected to study jiseis, short, poignant verses written to be read after one's death. These poems weren't just literary exercises. They were about preparation, composure. The idea that you should always be ready to die with dignity and with words worthy of your ancestors. For higher-level samurai education didn't stop at temple schools. There were domain schools, or hanko, sponsored by regional lords. These schools taught advanced Confucian philosophy history and military strategy. Students studied ancient Chinese texts and learned to navigate the complexities of statecraft. Some even explored astronomy medicine, or Western studies rangaku, as Japan began peeking curiously at the Dutch and their strange scientific tools. Meanwhile, peasants, artisans, and merchants, the majority of Japan's population, weren't left entirely out of the classroom. In fact, by the late Edo period, Japan had one of the highest literacy rates in the world, especially among urban populations. That's thanks again to the Terakoya system, which expanded beyond just samurai children. In cities like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto, children of tradesmen, shopkeepers, and even farmers attended these small, often informal schools. Education for commoners was practical. They learned how to read and write. Kana, the simpler Japanese syllabary, how to count money, and how to keep household records. Boys were trained to run the family business. Girls were taught to read enough to manage household finances, write letters, and compose proper poems for social occasions. And that mattered. In a world governed by hierarchy, writing well was a tool of upward mobility, even if you couldn't legally rise in class. A well-written letter could secure a good marriage, attract customers, or impress a powerful patron. Merchants especially understood this. Some merchant families paid handsomely to hire tutors or send their sons to better schools, knowing that sharp writing and sharper math could be more powerful than any blade. But education wasn't just about classroom lessons. It was embedded in apprenticeship culture. If you were born into an artisan family, your education came through repetition, observation, and brutal precision. A potter's son might spend 10 years just preparing clay before ever touching the wheel. A swordsmith's apprentice polished blades for 5 years before being allowed to heat one. Everything was passed down orally or through demonstration. There were no shortcuts, only sweat and silence. Even entertainers like geisha and kabuki actors underwent rigorous training from childhood. Geisha learned music, poetry, dance, and etiquette. Actors memorized epic scripts, mastered stylized gestures, and practiced exaggerated facial expressions until they could perform entire emotions with just a blink or a turn of the head. These were full educations, just not in the subjects you'd find in a scroll. And then there were the monasteries, centers of higher learning for monk scholars, and sometimes even Ronin masterless samurai looking to retreat from the chaos of secular life. Buddhist monks trained in sutra memorization, philosophical debate, and classical Chinese. Some studied medicine or astronomy. Zen monks in particular developed meditative practices that would later influence everything from martial arts to garden design. The monastery was a place where deep, quiet scholarship could flourish, but it wasn't open to everyone. Much of Japan's most advanced knowledge, especially in fields like medicine, navigation, or Western science, was guarded, confined to elite circles, or hidden behind language barriers. The ruling Tokugawa shogunate feared that too much information, especially foreign knowledge, could destabilize the careful order they'd built. Still, curiosity found cracks to slip through. Through the port of Nagasaki, where Dutch traders were allowed limited contact, rangaku, or Dutch learning, crept in. A handful of scholars learned to translate Dutch texts, unlocking European ideas about anatomy, geography, and physics. These early Japanese scientists worked in secret sharing notes, copying diagrams, sometimes even dissecting human cadavers, an unthinkable act in traditional Buddhism. By the 19th century, Japan had a deep intellectual foundation, built not on colonial conquest or imported universities, but on centuries of grassroots learning, oral tradition, and an unshakable belief that knowledge was sacred. But it came with limits. You couldn't study what you wanted if your class didn't allow it. Samurai studied Confucius and warfare. Merchants studied finance and etiquette. Peasants studied crops and taxes. Very few people crossed those lines. Education was both a ladder and a cage, something that elevated you, but only within the space you were allowed to stand. And yet, in those quiet classrooms and smoky workshops, Japan was preparing for change. The children of shopkeepers would become industrialists. The sons of samurai would become scholars. When the walls of isolation finally cracked open in the late 19th century, Japan didn't step blindly into modernity. It marched books in hand, minds sharpened. So, while shrines shaped the soul and the sword protected the body, it was the brush, the humble tool of teachers, monks, merchants, and apprentices that quietly carved Japan's future. Coming up next, as Japan's classes were learning and living in their rigid worlds, the land itself, its storms, earthquakes, and fires, was constantly reminding everyone who was really in charge. Let's explore how natural disasters shaped society and how resilience became part of the national identity. Feudal Japan sat on the so-called Ring of Fire, a seismically volatile stretch of the Pacific Basin. Earthquakes weren't rare events, they were a constant threat. And without modern engineering, every quake could be catastrophic. Villages built from wood and paper splintered in seconds. Castles, no matter how formidable, could crack and topple. Temples, once places of refuge, sometimes collapsed on the faithful seeking shelter. Imagine a typical farming community, waking to the dawn quiet until the ground shudders. Roof tiles tumble. Wells crack open. Children scream. Within minutes, thatched houses lie in splinters across rice fields. Families rush to open ground, dragging infants wrapped in straw. In a world already precarious, an earthquake could wipe out a season's harvest, kill livestock, and leave entire villages homeless. Leaders had to adapt. Daimyo's regional lords quickly learned that keeping rice stores and crafting emergency shelters was as vital as maintaining armies. After major quakes, some domains built temporary villages of bamboo and matting right outside castle walls. Peasants whose homes were destroyed could live there until their lands were safe again. While rebuilding costs strained domain treasuries, these measures prevented mass starvation and rebellion. But earthquakes weren't the only fury. Japan's typhoon season brought torrential rains and devastating winds. In coastal towns, wooden boats and fishing villages were swept away. Inland swollen rivers burst their banks, drowning fields and orchards. Monsoon storms turned narrow mountain passes into landslide chutes. Travelers risked being buried alive, trying to deliver messages between feudal courts. To guard against flood damage, peasants constructed levees and canal networks with samurai engineers supervising these large-scale projects. Rice paddies were terraced and connected by stone walls to channel excess water. In many villages, building and maintaining those walls was a communal duty. Missing work on the wall meant heavy fines, or worse. Over time, these collective efforts created sophisticated irrigation systems still admired today. And then there were the fires. Urban centers like Edo were built mostly of wood with paper screens separating rooms. A single spark, an overturned oil lamp, or a stray ember from a cooking hearth could erupt into a fiery gale fanned by strong winds, razing entire districts. In fact, Edo earned the nickname the Nation of Fires because of its frequent devastating blazes. When fire struck, samurai-led fire brigades sprang into action. These weren't modern firefighters, but organized groups armed with buckets, hooks, and axes. They pulled down neighboring houses to create fire breaks, flooded streets by diverting canals, and formed bucket chains to douse flames. The shogunate even established a dedicated firefighting unit called the Hygiene Complete, with distinctive uniforms and official badges. In between fires, they practiced drills, maintained equipment, and studied wind patterns, an early form of urban disaster preparedness. After each conflagration, rebuilding was an opportunity to improve. Architects introduced wider streets to act as fire breaks. Builders began using earthen walls and tiled roofs, materials less likely to ignite. Samurai mandated fire-resistant construction techniques in castle towns. Yet economic realities meant many peasants and merchants still lived in traditional wooden homes, vulnerable to the next spark. These disasters shaped not only architecture and infrastructure, but also social attitudes. In a land where the next tremor typhoon or blaze could strike without warning, impermanence wasn't just a Buddhist concept, it was everyday reality. People planned for the worst, stored extra grain, built homes with easy-to-replace components, kept rations in hidden caches, and they passed down oral traditions of what to do when the ground shakes. Hold a child close, move under a sturdy wooden beam. Stay away from riverbanks and never light a fire until after the tremors end. Education systems integrated these survival lessons. Terracotta classrooms taught children not just calligraphy, but also fire drill procedures. Temple schools combined scripture reading with instructions on tending embankments. Samurai engineers lectured peasants on reading the sky for storm warnings and measuring river depths for flood risks. Even geisha and courtesans in the pleasure districts kept emergency flasks of water by their chambers, just in case the lanterns sparked a blaze. Perhaps most importantly, these recurring calamities forged community solidarity. When one household's roof collapsed, neighbors pitched in to rebuild it. When a typhoon washed away a levee section, the entire village worked night and day to repair it. Even samurai lent hands alongside peasants. After a devastating quake, the lord himself might join commoners hauling stones for a new bridge. In a society sliced by rigid class distinctions, natural disasters blurred the lines and reminded everyone of a shared vulnerability. The literary records reflect this too. Poets composed elegies after fires reduced entire towns to ash. Scroll paintings depicted villagers working together to shore up embankments. Buddhist sermons invoked the fickleness of existence, urging compassion for those whose lives were undone by the elements. These artistic forms served as both warning and inspiration, teaching that human endurance could push back against nature's fury, even if only for a while. Yet, despite all precautions, entire domains occasionally faced near collapse. A sequence of poor harvests followed by flood, followed by an epidemic spreading swiftly through refugee camps, could leave a domain bankrupt. Daimyos were forced to request relief taxes from the shogunate, or borrow heavily from merchant houses, setting off cycles of debt that lasted generations. Sometimes a lord's mismanagement of disaster relief could spark peasant rebellions demanding lower taxes or improved infrastructure. Still, the overarching story is one of adaptation and innovation. The repeated shocks drove advances in engineering, governance, and social structure. Villagers grew adept at reading natural signs, animal behaviors, shifting winds, cloud formations to predict storms and quakes. Samurai bureaucrats developed record-keeping methods to track crop yields and canal maintenance. Merchants specialized in selling emergency supplies, rice oil lamps, warm clothing across regions ravaged by one disaster or another. By the late Edo period, These cumulative lessons created a society that, while still hierarchical, functioned with remarkable resilience. Centuries before modern civil defense, feudal Japan had local warning systems, volunteer brigades, communal stores, and building codes, all born from the relentless demands of nature. When the 1855 Edo earthquake struck, leveling thousands of homes, the existing fire brigades and levee repair crews mobilized within hours. Within days, temporary villages housed thousands of displaced families. And within weeks, artisans produced replacement roof tiles and paper screens at a scale that would have amazed earlier generations. This wasn't luck. It was preparedness honed by hundreds of years of practice. It was also the spiritual lesson of impermanence in action, accepting that disasters would come, but refusing to be undone by them. So, as we look back on feudal Japan's earthquakes, typhoons, and fires, we see more than destruction. We see a society that learned to weather every storm, to rise from every ash heap, and to stand firm even while the ground quaked beneath it. That resilience born of necessity would later serve Japan well as it faced the greater upheavals of modernization, war, and industrialization. Coming up next, Japan's encounter with the outside world, a force as unpredictable as any typhoon, would usher in seismic cultural shifts. In Point 9, we'll explore how those first foreign ships on the horizon altered the country forever. Stay tuned. If earthquakes shook the ground and typhoons scattered rooftops, then the arrival of foreign ships on Japan's shores was a storm of a different kind. One that didn't just rattle buildings, but entire belief systems. Up to this point in feudal Japan, everything, society, religion, education, architecture, was built to endure what nature could throw at it. But what happens when the disruption doesn't come from the sky or the earth, but from another country? Japan's relationship with the outside world during the Edo period was a carefully controlled one. Since the early 1600s, the Tokugawa shogunate had enacted sakoku, or the closed country policy. No one could leave. Very few could enter. Foreign trade was limited to a single port, Nagasaki, and even there only the Dutch and Chinese were allowed under tight surveillance. Christianity was banned. Western books were censored. The shogunate feared foreign influence the same way it feared plague or rebellion, with absolute seriousness. And in many ways, sakoku worked. For over 2 centuries, Japan remained internally focused, politically stable, and culturally rich. It didn't collapse like other parts of Asia under European colonial pressure. But this isolation came with a cost: technological stagnation, military underdevelopment, and growing economic strain as internal systems became outdated. That all changed dramatically in 1853, when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy arrived in Edo Bay with a squadron of steam-powered black ships. Imagine the scene: villagers crowding cliffs, staring in disbelief at vessels belching smoke, roaring with engines armed with cannons they had never seen before. The samurai who once ruled the battlefield with a katana suddenly looked like they were holding wooden sticks in the face of an iron storm. Perry didn't ask. He demanded. The letter he brought from U.S. President Millard Fillmore insisted Japan open its ports to American trade and provide aid to shipwrecked sailors. He promised to return the following year for an answer. And when he did, with even more ships, the message was clear: the age of isolation was over. The Tokugawa government, ill-prepared, divided, and technologically outmatched, signed the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854. It opened 2 ports to American ships and granted the U.S. most favored nation status. Soon after, similar treaties were signed with Britain, Russia, France, and the Netherlands. These agreements, known as the unequal treaties, were heavily lopsided in favor of Western powers. Japan had no say in tariff rates. Foreigners were granted legal immunity on Japanese soil. It was national humiliation without a single shot fired. And yet, it wasn't total defeat. It was awakening. For the first time in over 200 years, Japan was forced to look outward, and it didn't like what it saw. European empires were colonizing vast swaths of Asia. China, Japan's cultural elder, had been devastated by the Opium Wars. India was under British control. And Japan, it was next unless it changed fast. This moment sparked a tidal wave of reform and resistance. Samurai were split. Some believed Japan needed to embrace Western technology to survive. Others wanted to expel the foreigners entirely. Peasants, overtaxed and weary from disasters, began protesting again. Merchants were emboldened finally. Their knowledge of trade and international contact was an asset, not a liability. And then came the Meiji Restoration in 1868. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's focus on the emotional and cultural fallout during the final years of the Edo period. In schools, Confucian ideals were suddenly under question. Could loyalty to the shogun be reconciled with the obvious failures of his rule? Was isolation still honorable if it left the country vulnerable? Teachers began to introduce Western science and geography quietly. At first, then, with increasing urgency. Rangaku, or Dutch learning, became more widely accepted. Microscope lenses were examined with awe. Telegraphs, steam engines, and printing presses became objects of national obsession. Samurai, who had spent generations training with swords, were now expected to study gunnery and foreign languages. Some resisted. Others embraced the change and became translators, diplomats, even inventors. There was a brief period of cultural whiplash with men in top knots walking past foreigners in bowler hats. Samurai in armor standing guard outside buildings where European engineers were laying telegraph cables. Merchants saw opportunity. They began importing Western goods clocks, fabrics, telescopes. They also started exporting Japanese items with renewed intensity: ceramics, tea silk, ukiyo-e prints. Suddenly, Japan was on the map, literally and economically. And as international ships arrived more frequently, port cities like Yokohama, Kobe, and Nagasaki transformed overnight into cosmopolitan hubs, buzzing with multiple languages, currencies, and cultures. But not everyone saw this change as exciting. For many in the countryside, the arrival of foreigners brought anxiety, confusion, even despair. Temples held ceremonies to pray for divine protection against barbarians. Prophets and mystics predicted apocalyptic scenarios. Farmers feared their daughters would be kidnapped or their rice fields seized. In some cases, foreign missionaries were attacked. In others, Japanese Christians previously persecuted for generations came out of hiding, emboldened by international support. And through it all, the old ways didn't vanish, they fought back. There were rebellions, attempts to assassinate foreign diplomats, secret samurai factions plotting to restore imperial rule. The tension was everywhere, in the streets of Edo, in the courts of daimyos, even in the quiet alleys of Kyoto, where monks debated how to keep their teachings alive in a rapidly changing world. This period wasn't just a transition from isolation to openness. It was an identity crisis, one that every Japanese person, farmer, warrior, monk, or merchant had to face in real time. What did it mean to be Japanese now? Could you drink Western coffee, wear French fabric, read Dutch anatomy books, and still bow before the commies? There were no clear answers, only a growing certainty that the old world was slipping away and a new one was crashing ashore. But what made Japan different from other colonized nations was this: it didn't surrender. It adapted. It studied. It experimented. It made the pain of humiliation into fuel for transformation. The shock of foreign intrusion wasn't the end. It was the beginning of one of the most rapid modernizations in human history. Coming up next, Japan's reinvention is about to begin. The Meiji Restoration will tear down the samurai class, rewrite the nation's values, and launch Japan onto the global stage. But in the ashes of tradition, what gets lost and what new identity will rise? Stay with us for Point 10, Rebirth through Revolution. If the Black Ships shattered Japan's illusion of invulnerability, then the Meiji Restoration was its answer. Equal parts revolution, reinvention, and resurrection. It marked the final breathtaking turn in the story we've been following from rice paddies and swords to steam engines and statecraft. From rigid caste rolls to national transformation. And unlike the violent colonization faced by many other nations in the 19th century, Japan's transformation was largely self-inflicted, sharp, painful, and astonishingly fast. When we left off in Point 9, Japan had signed the unequal treaties, endured the humiliation of foreign intrusion, and was watching its ancient social structure begin to tremble. But it wasn't just the treaties that broke faith in the Tokugawa shogunate. It was their inability to respond. To many Japanese, it was clear the old regime had failed, and so in 1868, something unprecedented happened. The Tokugawa shogunate, the ruling military government that had controlled Japan for over 260 years, was overthrown. In its place, power was officially restored to the emperor, a figure who had existed largely as a religious symbol for centuries. The new leader, a teenage boy known posthumously as Emperor Meiji, became the face of Japan's rebirth. But let's be clear, this wasn't a return to some golden age. The Meiji Restoration wasn't about nostalgia. It was a forward leap into modernity. And it began by tearing the old world apart. First to fall was the samurai class. For centuries, they had stood at the top of the social hierarchy, the living embodiment of honor and martial strength. But in the new Japan, what the country needed wasn't swordsmen. It was scientists, engineers, bankers, teachers. Within a few short years, the government abolished samurai privileges, including their stipends, their right to wear swords in public, and their exclusive claim to military power. Many samurai were furious. Some rebelled, most famously in the Satsuma Rebellion of 1877, led by Saigo Takamori, a former government loyalist turned icon of resistance. But the rebellion failed. The age of the samurai was over, and in its place came something new. The citizen soldier. The Meiji government instituted universal conscription, requiring all men, regardless of class, to serve in a modern national army. This was a radical shift. Warfare, once the sacred domain of elite warriors, was now the job of commoners, trained with rifles, not swords. And this military wasn't just a tool of defense, it was a symbol of equality of shared duty, of a Japan that belonged to all Japanese. But militarization was just the beginning. The Meiji leaders knew that to survive in a world of empires, Japan couldn't just tinker around the edges, it had to build a modern state from the ground up. And so they launched a breathtaking campaign of reform that touched every aspect of life. They rewrote the education system, creating a compulsory national curriculum that emphasized science, math, moral training, and loyalty to the emperor. Schools sprang up across the country. Literacy surged. Young boys and girls, many of them the grandchildren of rice farmers or foot soldiers, were suddenly learning about Darwin, Newton, and democracy. They overhauled the economy, adopting Western banking models, establishing a national currency, and investing in infrastructure, railways, telegraph lines, modern ports. They sent students and scholars abroad to study European and American systems, and then brought those ideas home, adapting them for Japan's unique context. And they rewrote the social contract. The feudal class system was officially dismantled. Commoners could now own land, choose their professions, and move freely. Former merchants became industrialists. Former samurai became bureaucrats or professors. The lines that had once defined people from birth They were blurring fast. But not everything was smooth. For many, the pace of change was disorienting, even brutal. Peasants now required to pay land taxes in cash rather than rice sometimes lost their farms. Former samurai, stripped of their identity, fell into poverty or despair. Traditional village structures with their seasonal festivals and ancestral rhythms struggled to survive in a new world of factories and train stations. And yet, within a single generation, Japan went from a feudal backwater to a modern nation-state. Think about that. In the early 1850s, most Japanese had never seen a steam engine. By the 1890s, Japan had its own railway networks, warships, telegraph systems, and universities. In 1905, less than 4 decades after the Meiji Restoration, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, stunning the Western world and proving that it had joined the ranks of global powers. But this rapid ascent came with new questions. Questions that would echo into the 20th century and beyond. Who were the Japanese now? They had traded swords for suits, shrines for schoolhouses, rice taxes for banknotes. They had watched their gods recede into ceremony, their customs reshaped by factories and foreign ideas. They had rebuilt their country with dazzling success. But what had they lost in the process? The samurai's death poem was replaced by national anthems. The floating world dimmed as electric lights lit up modern cities. Ukiyo-e gave way to photography. The land of ancestors and rituals had become the land of blueprints and deadlines, and yet something ancient remained. In the discipline of factory workers, in the humility of civil servants, in the reverence for nature, even amidst steel and smoke. The core values, duty, harmony, perseverance had survived. They had simply evolved. The Meiji Restoration wasn't the end of Japan's story. It was the beginning of its modern identity, a nation that could bend without breaking, adapt without forgetting, compete without losing its soul. And as we wrap this journey from rice paddies to railroads, from wooden sandals to warships, from spiritual stillness to national revolution, we see that Japan's true genius wasn't just in its warriors or poets, but in its capacity for transformation. Not every society can burn down the house and build something stronger from the ashes, but feudal Japan could and did. If the Meiji Restoration rebuilt Japan from the bones of its feudal past, then the decades that followed were when that new skeleton began to walk and stumble. Because while the steam engine's factories and schools heralded Japan's arrival into the modern world, the real cost of that transformation wasn't just in gold or treaties. It was in the lives of ordinary people who were suddenly caught between two worlds. The one their ancestors had built over centuries, and the one being forged in real time under smokestacks and electric wires. Let's start with the cities. During the Edo period, most people lived in the countryside, bound to the rhythms of rice planting, seasonal festivals, and shrine rituals. But by the late 19th and early 20th centuries, urban migration exploded. Tokyo, formerly Edo, Osaka, and Yokohama, ballooned in population as people left their ancestral homes to seek work in factories, shipyards, and office buildings. For many, it was their first time living in a multi-story apartment, eating food made by strangers, or riding in a train. But with that new life came disorientation. Imagine growing up in a quiet mountain village where you bow to elders, greet the sunrise with a shrine offering, and walk barefoot through moss-covered paths. Then, at 17, you board a train and arrive in Tokyo. Suddenly, you're surrounded by stone buildings, telegraph poles, men in bowler hats, and newspapers in Western print. You work 12-hour shifts in a spinning mill or electrical plant, eat rice out of a tin box, and sleep in a cramped tenement shared with 6 strangers. It's not a better life. It's just a different one. And for many, it was lonely. The communal structure of feudal villages, where everyone knew your name, your family, and your story, was replaced by anonymity. In the city, no one cared who your father was or what shrine you cleaned. You were a cog in a much larger machine. Efficiency mattered. Tradition didn't. The same hand that once planted rice in rhythm with the seasons now tightened bolts on a foreign-designed assembly line. This was especially jarring for women. In the Meiji era, the state promoted the ideal of the good wife, wise mother, Ryosai Kenbo, which emphasized obedience, domesticity, and moral virtue. But the industrial economy had other ideas. Young women, often from peasant families, became the backbone of Japan's new textile industry. They worked in spinning mills, lived in dormitories, and sent their earnings home. Many were as young as 12. Conditions were harsh. Long hours, poor ventilation, minimal rights. Factory girls became symbols of both progress and exploitation. Meanwhile, education was expanding, but unevenly. While boys now had access to modern schooling and potential civil service careers, girls were still largely taught manners, moral education, and home economics. Higher education remained limited for women, despite the growing demand for female teachers and nurses. The message was clear: modern Japan needed women to help build the future, but only within the limits set by men. Even clothing became a battleground of identity. The traditional kimono, once worn by all classes, was gradually replaced, at least among men, by Western suits, military uniforms, and student caps. Government officials, police officers, postal workers, they were all required to wear uniforms modeled after Europe. The emperor himself appeared in Western dress, signaling that modernization wasn't just policy, it was a performance. For the elite, adopting Western customs became a status symbol. They held ballroom dances, drank coffee, used forks, and knives, played piano. Yet at the same time, they clung to certain Japanese aesthetics. Tea ceremonies, flower arranging, no theater. It was a double identity, carefully curated. But not everyone played the part easily. In the countryside, many resisted the pace of change. Elders lamented that youth no longer respected tradition. Farmers resented land taxes that had to be paid in cash, not rice. Some villages formed conservative leagues, pushing back against compulsory schooling, military drafts, and loss of shrine authority. They weren't opposed to change per se, but they wanted change that still felt like Japan. And then there were the Burakumin, descendants of outcast communities from the feudal era, previously relegated to unclean professions like tanning, butchery, and execution. Even though the Meiji government officially abolished caste distinctions, discrimination remained brutal. Many Burakumin were barred from certain jobs, segregated in schools, and excluded from marriage with non-Burakumin. Modernization had promised equality, but prejudice survived under the surface. The same was true for Ainu people in the north and Okinawans in the south, ethnic minorities who were absorbed into the new nation-state under the guise of unification, but whose languages, traditions, and autonomy were stripped away. They were labeled backward, forced into Japanese schools, made to adopt new names, and often left behind in the national rush toward progress. And yet, even as all these tensions brewed, Japan kept moving forward. Railroads expanded. Industry surged. Foreign diplomats were impressed by Japan's discipline, work ethic, and vision. The world watched with a mix of admiration and unease. How had this once isolated nation reinvented itself so quickly? The answer is complicated. Yes, Japan modernized, but it did so at a breakneck pace that left many people emotionally, spiritually, and socially adrift. The structures that once gave life meaning, clan loyalty, seasonal rituals, local shrines, had been hollowed out, repackaged, or left behind. In their place came clocks, factories, slogans, and state-mandated patriotism. And yet, people adapted. A factory worker still made time to visit a shrine. A student reading Western literature still removed their shoes before entering the home. A government clerk in a starched collar still honored their ancestors with incense and quiet prayer. The soul of Japan didn't vanish. It folded inward, protecting itself as the nation hurtled toward the 20th century. It's easy to romanticize the samurai or criticize the factory age. But what really defined this period wasn't swords or steam. It was the individual Japanese person, torn between two worlds, finding their footing on a bridge that was still being built beneath them. Coming up next, as Japan modernized internally, its gaze shifted outward. It was no longer just trying to keep up with the West, it was now ready to compete with it. In Point 12, we'll explore how a newly modern Japan stepped onto the world stage with ambition, confidence, and a growing imperial appetite that would change the course of Asian history forever. By the dawn of the 20th century, Japan had accomplished something astonishing. In just a few short decades, it had gone from a secluded island nation defined by samurai codes and rice taxes to a fully modernized industrial state with railroads, factories, compulsory education, and a national army. But this internal transformation sparked something new: ambition. Japan wasn't just modernizing anymore, it was looking outward. The lesson from the West had been learned well in a world dominated by empires. You expand, or you get expanded upon. And Japan had no intention of being anyone's colony. This marked the beginning of Japan's imperial chapter, a period when the country turned from defensive modernization to assertive geopolitics, redrawing maps, reshaping Asia, and rewriting its role in world affairs. It began modestly. In 1894, Japan went to war with its longtime cultural cousin China in what became known as the First Sino-Japanese War. The conflict was about influence over Korea, which both nations had historically regarded as a strategic and symbolic prize. But Japan, now armed with modern rifles, steel warships, and Western military doctrine, crushed the Qing dynasty forces with shocking speed. The victory stunned the world. For the first time in modern history, an Asian country had defeated a major imperial power. The Treaty of Shimonoseki gave Japan control of Taiwan and recognized Korean independence, effectively removing China's historical grip on the peninsula. But it didn't stop there. In 1904, Japan went to war again, this time against a European power, Russia, in the Russo-Japanese War. The issue was, again, Korea and parts of Manchuria, where both nations had territorial ambitions. No one expected Japan to win. Russia had more men, more resources, more prestige. But what Russia had in size, it lacked in speed and coordination. Japan struck fast and hard land battles in Manchuria, a naval ambush at Port Arthur, and finally, the decisive destruction of the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima Strait. The world watched in awe. A non-Western nation had defeated a European empire in full-scale war. For colonized peoples across Asia, it was a beacon of hope. For European powers, it was a wake-up call. And for Japan, it was validation. Modernity wasn't something they had borrowed. They had made it their own. But this rise came with a darker turn. Victory fed nationalism. Nationalism fed expansionism. And soon, Japan wasn't just defending its interests, it was building an empire. Korea, once the focus of so many conflicts, was officially annexed by Japan in 1910, becoming a colony. Japanese officials took control of Korean education, industry, language, and government. The Korean flag was outlawed. Korean students were forced to learn Japanese. Land was seized. Resistance was brutally suppressed. To many in Japan, this was progress. To many in Korea, it was oppression and the beginning of a long and painful occupation that would last until 1945. Still back home, Japan was riding high. The early 20th century saw the nation enter World War I on the side of the Allies, not as a major battlefield player, but as a strategic opportunist. While Europe was tearing itself apart, Japan moved to seize German-controlled islands in the Pacific and expand its influence in China. It came out of the war stronger, with a seat at the negotiating table and recognition as a legitimate global power. In 1920, Japan joined the League of Nations. Its diplomats walked the same halls as British, French, and American leaders. Its industrialists exported goods around the globe. Tokyo's elite drank coffee, read Tolstoy, and sent their children to universities in Berlin and Boston. But beneath this glowing surface, cracks were forming. The human cost of empire was growing. In Taiwan, in Korea, and later in parts of China, Japanese rule became increasingly harsh, marked by censorship, forced assimilation, economic exploitation, and military presence. At home, veterans of foreign campaigns returned with a different kind of pride, fierce, disciplined, but increasingly intolerant of dissent. Political assassinations became more common. Right-wing nationalism gained strength. The military, once a tool of national defense, began to influence politics from behind the curtain. Even the economy, so recently praised for its growth, started to buckle under pressure. As the Great Depression of the 1930s swept across the globe, Japan faced shrinking exports, rising unemployment, and growing public frustration. Many began to believe that Japan's survival depended not just on industry, but on resources, especially oil, coal, and land. And where were those in China? In Southeast Asia? In places that would require further expansion and more conflict? But let's pause here. It's easy in hindsight to view this imperial period as inevitable. A rise in power, a thirst for influence, a spiral into militarism. But for many Japanese people at the time, this era felt complex. A source of pride, certainly, but also confusion. Japan had modernized to resist Western domination, but in doing so, it was starting to mimic the very empires it once feared. And in the villages, in the factories, in the new schools, and shrinking temples, ordinary people were caught in this contradiction. Were they building a nation of peace and prosperity, or helping to feed an empire that would consume Asia? Young men were drafted. Factory quotas rose. Students were taught that loyalty to the emperor was the highest virtue. Meanwhile, Western dress and jazz music filled Tokyo cafes. It was a time of collision between tradition and ambition, between progress and aggression. And all of this, the rapid rise, the military campaigns, the growing control over foreign lands, was setting the stage for something far bigger. Something devastating. Something the world would never forget. Because the next chapter in Japan's story isn't just about modernity or empire. It's about war on a scale the nation had never seen. Coming up next, we'll follow Japan into the heart of the 1930s and 40s through invasion, occupation, and a global conflict that would end not just in defeat, but in fire ash and the unimaginable power of the atomic age. In Point 13, we enter World War II from the Japanese perspective. By the 1930s, Japan had become something unimaginable just a few decades earlier, a modern empire with a Western-style military colonies stretching across Asia and a seat at the world's most powerful tables. But beneath that success was a storm, building one born of resource scarcity, nationalism, military ambition, and a belief in Japan's divine destiny to lead Asia. And that storm was about to break. Let's rewind to 1931. In the northeastern part of China, a region known as Manchuria, Japanese troops staged a false flag incident, blowing up a section of railway and blaming it on Chinese forces. This gave Japan a pretext to invade. The takeover was swift and brutal. By 1932, Japan had created a puppet state called Manchukuo, ruled in name by China's last emperor, but in reality controlled by the Japanese army. This was no longer about defense. This was expansion by force, and it wouldn't stop with Manchuria. The military, increasingly powerful in Japanese politics, saw conquest as the key to survival. Japan needed land labor, coal oil, and prestige. Civilian leaders who questioned the army's plans were sidelined, silenced, or assassinated. Newspapers pushed ultranationalist rhetoric. Children in schools learned that Japan was the spiritual center of the world, and the emperor was a living god. Then came 1937, and the full-scale invasion of China. What followed was one of the darkest chapters in modern history, the Second Sino-Japanese War. Japanese troops poured into Chinese cities and villages, often greeted not with resistance, but with terror. And nowhere was that terror more horrifying than in Nanjing. After Japanese forces captured the Chinese capital in December 1937, they unleashed 6 weeks of mass murder, rape, and destruction in what became known as the Rape of Nanjing. Historians estimate that between 200,000 to 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war were slaughtered. Tens of thousands of women were raped, many of them tortured or killed afterward. These were not battlefield casualties. These were war crimes committed with shocking brutality, documented even by foreign diplomats in the city. And back in Japan, many newspapers celebrated the victory without mentioning the horror. The military censored dissent. The public, largely unaware of the full truth, continued to rally behind the empire. Japan's war in China dragged on for years. But the real global flashpoint came in 1941, when Japan made a decision that would change the course of world history. At this point, Japan was bogged down in China, facing an economic blockade from the West, particularly from the United States, which had cut off vital exports like oil and scrap metal. Japan, with few natural resources of its own, saw this as an act of aggression. Military leaders believed their only chance of survival was to secure the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia, and to do that, they would need to knock the United States out of the Pacific. And so, on December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. It was a devastating strike. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. Over 2,400 Americans killed. Within 24 hours, the U.S. declared war. Japan, already locked in war with China, had now entered a global conflict that would become World War II. At first, Japan's victories were rapid and dramatic. Its forces swept through Hong Kong, Malaya, the Philippines, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. The empire now spanned thousands of miles. Propaganda spoke of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a vision of an Asia liberated from Western colonialism and united under Japanese leadership. But in reality, Japan replaced Western colonizers with its own brutal occupation. In many territories, civilians suffered under forced labor, food shortages, and martial law. Comfort women, women and girls from Korea, China, the Philippines, and other occupied regions were trafficked into military-run brothels. In POW camps, Allied soldiers were subjected to starvation, torture, and death marches. Resistance movements rose, and in response, Japanese forces cracked down with violence. And back home, the Japanese people were enduring their own form of hardship. As the war dragged on, rationing intensified. Cities suffered repeated bombings. Food was scarce. Civilians melted down their pots and pans for scrap metal. Children carried bamboo spears and trained for an imagined American invasion. Total war meant total sacrifice, but it was in 1945 that the empire's world began to collapse. After a long and bloody campaign through the Pacific, American forces were closing in. Island by island, Japan was losing ground. Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Each battle grew more desperate. Civilians were ordered to fight or even commit suicide rather than surrender. Pilots became kamikaze, deliberately crashing their planes into enemy ships in suicide attacks. It was honor over life, loyalty over logic. Then came August 6, 1945. A single American B-29 bomber named Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima. In an instant, over 70,000 people were killed. Tens of thousands more died in the following days from burns, radiation, and injury. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki. The devastation was unimaginable. Entire neighborhoods vaporized. Survivors called hibakusha walked through burning streets with skin hanging from their bodies. Hospitals were gone. Families incinerated. The emperor's divine authority couldn't stop the sun from falling from the sky. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed the nation by radio for the first time in history. His voice was calm, distant, almost otherworldly. He didn't use the word surrender, but he spoke of enduring the unendurable. Japan had lost. The war was over, but the real reckoning had just begun. Over 3 million Japanese were dead. Cities were rubble. Food was scarce. The empire was gone. The people were stunned not just by defeat, but by the collapse of everything they had been told was unshakable. The emperor's divinity, the nation's invincibility, the glory of expansion. And so began the long, painful process of reflection. For some, there was guilt over atrocities committed over blind obedience over silence. For others, there was only grief. And for many, there was confusion. What did it mean to be Japanese now? Coming up next. In Point 14, we'll explore the post-war years occupation rebuilding and the redefinition of a national identity. How did Japan rise from the ashes? What lessons were carried forward and what was left unspoken? When the bombs fell, so did the illusion of permanence. Japan's cities were ash. Its military was disbanded. The emperor, once believed to be divine, had addressed the nation as a mortal voice through a crackling radio. The war was over. But what followed wasn't peace exactly. It was uncertainty. In August 1945, Japan surrendered unconditionally. In September, Allied forces arrived to occupy the country, an occupation unlike anything Japan had ever known. The conquerors weren't Mongols or rival clans. They were Americans led by General Douglas MacArthur, who walked through the ruins of Tokyo in full military uniform, clipboard in hand, like a stern school principal surveying a burned-down classroom. But instead of punishment, the Allies, especially the US, set out to rebuild Japan, not destroy it. They had their reasons. The Cold War was beginning. Communism was spreading in China. The US didn't want Japan to collapse into chaos and drift into Soviet influence. So instead of dismantling the nation, they aimed to reshape it socially, politically, and economically. Let's start with the political transformation. In 1947, under American guidance, Japan adopted a new constitution, one that remains in place to this day. At its core was a radical promise. Japan renounced war. Forever. Article 9 of the Constitution declared that Japan would maintain no standing army, no navy, no air force, only self-defense forces. For a country whose identity had been so deeply rooted in militarism, this was nothing short of revolutionary. Power was now centered in an elected parliament, not the emperor. Hirohito remained on the throne, but only as a symbol, not a ruler. Women gained the right to vote. Labor unions were encouraged. Land reform broke up the massive estates of the pre-war elite and redistributed farmland to millions of tenant farmers. The caste system was abolished again, this time with more enforcement. Education was rebuilt from the ground up, emphasizing democracy, science, and individual thought. But it wasn't just institutions that changed, it was daily life. In the first years after the war, survival was the priority. Cities were still rubble. Food was rationed. Children scavenged for scraps. Many lived in makeshift homes, or in black market slums where entire families slept in cardboard boxes or burned refuse for warmth. Inflation was rampant. The currency was nearly worthless. Crime surged. And yet, people endured. And then, gradually, something began to shift. Factories that once built weapons began producing consumer goods, bicycles, radios, kitchen appliances. American aid, including the Marshall Plan, poured in. Roads were rebuilt. Infrastructure was modernized. Foreign advisors helped restructure industries. And the Japanese people, disciplined, educated, and determined, did what they had always done in the face of hardship. They adapted. By the 1950s, the economy began to stir. Companies like Toyota, Sony, Mitsubishi, and Panasonic pivoted from wartime production to innovation. Cheap, reliable goods from Japan started to flood international markets. First toys and textiles, then electronics, then cars. Japan, once viewed as the defeated nation of the Pacific, was now being praised for its efficiency, quality, and relentless drive. By the 1960s, the so-called Japanese economic miracle was in full motion. Cities rebuilt as gleaming metropolises. Bullet trains, Shinkansen, were introduced, symbolizing speed, precision, and progress. Education became fiercely competitive. The work ethic, once instilled in feudal discipline and wartime slogans, now powered office towers and assembly lines. And in 1964, Tokyo hosted the Olympic Games, a global coming-out party for the new Japan. The same city that had once burned in firebomb raids now welcomed the world with neon lights, steel skyscrapers, and a bullet train that ran like clockwork. But beneath the surface, deeper questions simmered. What did it mean to be Japanese after the war? The past hadn't disappeared. It had been buried, reframed, or simply left unspoken. The emperor, though stripped of divine status, remained in place, never tried for war crimes, never made to testify publicly. The Tokyo war crimes trials held some generals accountable, but many architects of imperial policy went on to hold government or corporate positions in the new era. In classrooms, history textbooks glossed over the worst atrocities of the war. The rape of Nanjing. The comfort women, the Unit 731 medical experiments, these were topics many preferred not to discuss. For a generation raised on slogans of divine destiny and empire, the sudden pivot to pacifism and democracy left a vacuum and identity rupture. And yet, most people didn't dwell on the contradiction. They were too busy rebuilding lives, starting families, catching the train to work, saving for a television, sending their kids to cram schools. The war for many became a ghost, always present, rarely acknowledged, but not forgotten. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hibakusha became powerful voices for peace. Their stories, often silenced, at first began to enter the public consciousness. Anti-nuclear movements gained traction. Artists, writers, and filmmakers explored the trauma, the ambiguity, the silence of a nation that had been both victim and aggressor. In time, Japan would emerge not just as an economic giant, but as a cultural force, spreading its cinema, literature, fashion, cuisine, and eventually its pop culture, anime, manga, and video games across the globe. And through it all, the country carried the memory of what it had been: a land of warriors, then of workers, a nation of shrines, then of subways, a place of ritual, then of reinvention. This post-war period wasn't just about rebuilding cities. It was about rebuilding meaning, about reconciling honor with defeat, progress with memory, identity with survival. Coming up next. In Point 15, we'll explore how Japan turned inward again in the 1970s and 80s, facing the emotional cost of prosperity, the strain of overwork, and the quiet resurgence of nostalgia for a simpler, older Japan that seemed to vanish in the race to modernity. By the 1970s, Japan was no longer rebuilding. It was rising fast. Cities buzzed with activity, bullet trains stitched the country together with precision, and Japanese-made electronics and automobiles flooded international markets. From Tokyo to Osaka, neon-lit skylines reflected not just progress, but pride. The economic miracle had become a global headline. Japan, once humbled by war, had redefined itself as a technological powerhouse, a model of discipline and industrial success. But beneath the polished surface of high-speed growth, something quieter was unfolding. Something that numbers couldn't measure, a deep growing sense of personal disconnection. As the country prospered, so did the demands of its work culture. Companies expected total dedication. Loyalty was measured in overtime hours, and climbing the corporate ladder often meant sacrificing weekends, family time, and sleep. This system, known informally as lifetime employment, offered job security, but it also demanded near religious commitment. Workers became salarymen, neatly dressed, obedient, efficient. They packed commuter trains each morning like clockwork and returned home long after their children were asleep. In the office, they were expected to be tireless. Outside the office, they were expected to drink with colleagues, socialize with clients, and maintain harmony at all costs. By the 1980s, this way of life was showing its cracks. Japan's GDP soared, but so did stress, exhaustion, and mental strain. The word karoshi, death by overwork, entered the national vocabulary. Cases of middle-aged men collapsing from heart attacks or strokes became disturbingly common. Many lived alone in company dormitories, estranged from their families. The cultural emphasis on perseverance gamen, which had once helped Japan endure the war and its aftermath, was now pushing individuals to silently endure burnout, depression, and isolation. The price of collective success was often personal sacrifice. For younger generations, this pressure was suffocating. The education system, once a point of pride, became a relentless grind. Students studied from dawn to midnight, attended cram schools after regular classes, and faced staggering pressure to pass entrance exams for elite high schools and universities. Failure wasn't just academic, it was social. A poor exam score could mean a lifetime of limited opportunities, disappointing one's family, or falling behind in a society that valued uniformity and success above all. Many young people began to withdraw. Some quietly disengaged from school or work and retreated into their bedrooms, refusing to come out for months or even years. This phenomenon, known as hikikomori, became a haunting symbol of a generation unable or unwilling to meet the expectations placed on them. They weren't lazy or defiant. They were overwhelmed. In a culture where conformity was a survival strategy, stepping away from the system often meant stepping into silence. At the same time, a wave of cultural nostalgia began to take shape. As concrete cities replaced ancient villages and vending machines stood where shrines once did, people began to long for a slower, more rooted Japan. Traditional arts, once dismissed as old-fashioned, began to see a quiet revival. Tea ceremonies, calligraphy, ikebana, and kimono making attracted new interest, especially among younger people seeking meaning beyond consumerism. Nature, too, took on symbolic weight. The image of cherry blossoms, fleeting, beautiful, and impermanent, resonated more than ever in a society where time seemed to move too fast. Pop culture reflected this shift. Anime and manga, which exploded in popularity both at home and abroad, often portrayed quiet rural life, interpersonal connection, and the emotional struggles of youth. Films depicted not just heroes or history, but everyday sadness, lost time, forgotten traditions, unspoken feelings. Even Japan's obsession with cutting-edge technology couldn't erase the sense that something essential had been left behind. This sense of spiritual and cultural longing also led to a more complex reckoning with the past. While Japan's post-war decades had emphasized peace, democracy, and economic growth, Many difficult aspects of history, particularly those involving the war, remained unspoken in public discourse. But by the 1980s, artists, filmmakers, and intellectuals began to ask harder questions. What had been forgotten in the name of rebuilding? What truths had been softened or erased? Works like Grave of the Fireflies didn't glorify war, they mourned it. Through the eyes of orphaned children, they showed the cost of blind nationalism and the quiet suffering of civilians. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki continued to speak out. Museums were built not only to remember the victims of the atomic bombings, but to question the choices that led there. And yet, tension remained. Debates over school textbooks, visits to controversial shrines, and public silence on issues like comfort women revealed a nation still struggling to balance memory with national pride. At the same time, Japan's identity abroad was evolving. No longer the defeated nation of 1945 or the economic juggernaut of the 80s, Japan had become something more subtle, a cultural force. Sushi video games, anime minimalism, Zen gardens, fashion robotics. Japan was now defined not by conquest or GDP, but by influence. It didn't need to shout to be heard. Its identity was quiet, layered, and complex. And so, by the end of the 20th century, Japan had become a country of paradoxes. Wealthy but aging, innovative but nostalgic, globally admired but internally uncertain. It had achieved stability, prosperity, and peace, yet it carried just beneath the surface a sense of something unresolved. Because progress, as Japan learned firsthand, is never just about moving forward. Sometimes it means looking back and asking at what cost. By the early 2000s, Japan had stabilized financially, politically, socially. The shock of the war, the breakneck industrial growth, the suffocating work culture of the salaryman era, all of it had given way to a quieter, more reflective stage of national life. The country was no longer in a state of emergency or euphoria. It was existing in what felt like a long exhale. But beneath that calm surface, something new had begun to stir. A shift in consciousness. A slow generational turning away from inherited obligations toward a search for something more personal, more human, more real. The generation coming of age in the early 21st century was the first truly post-industrial generation in Japan's history. They had not known war. They had not known the hunger of the post-war years or the pride of economic conquest. They were born into a Japan that was materially comfortable, globally connected, and technologically advanced, but also into one that was aging rapidly, emotionally restrained, and still haunted by the invisible expectations of conformity. And so they began quietly at first to change the narrative. Young people increasingly questioned the lifetime employment system their parents had endured. Many refused to join the traditional workforce altogether, choosing instead freelance jobs, creative industries, part-time work, or entrepreneurship. Others pursued alternative lifestyles, moved back to rural areas, or rejected the notion that success was defined by a company badge and a full pension. The term "freeter," someone who floats between jobs or works independently, became common. It wasn't always celebrated. Older generations often viewed them as lost or lazy. But for many, it was a way to reclaim time autonomy and personal identity in a system that had long suppressed both. Women in particular began to push against the constraints of post-war gender roles. While the ideal of the good wife, wise mother still echoed in advertising and family pressure, a growing number of women delayed or rejected. Marriage chose careers, lived alone, and demanded more space in public life. Japan's notoriously low birth rate wasn't just a demographic issue, it was also a reflection of this broader societal shift. People were no longer simply following the script. They were writing their own. In cities like Tokyo, Kyoto, and Fukuoka, Creativity bloomed in corners once overlooked. Independent bookstores thrived. Handmade coffee shops curated entire philosophies around slowness and care. Fashion designers blended tradition and rebellion. Musicians, filmmakers, and writers explored loneliness, identity, memory. Pop culture, already one of Japan's most successful exports, deepened in both style and substance. Anime like Your Name or A Silent Voice resonated not just for their beauty, but for their emotional honesty, depicting longing, disconnection, and unspoken pain with startling empathy. Technology remained central, but not without tension. Japan continued to lead in robotics, gaming, and digital innovation. But unlike Silicon Valley's fast-paced disruption model, Japanese innovation often leaned toward refinement, elegance, and quiet utility. There were robots designed not to replace workers, but to comfort the elderly. Apps that taught mindfulness. Devices that didn't scream for attention, but whispered gently. Even in hypermodernity, Japan's sense of subtlety endured. At the same time, old wounds began to find new language. Survivors of Hiroshima and Nagasaki published memoirs. Documentaries on wartime atrocities once niche found wider audiences. The children and grandchildren of Hibakusha began to speak openly about intergenerational trauma. Japan's relationships with Korea and China, still complicated by unresolved war history, remained a source of tension, but also of dialogue. The past, for so long buried beneath politeness and pragmatism, had started to resurface. Not as shame, but as something to be understood. Meanwhile, the country's greatest challenge was no longer war or growth. It was aging. By the 2010s, over a quarter of the population was over 65. Entire towns began to empty. Schools closed. Trains ran with only a few elderly passengers. In some villages, wild animals moved into abandoned houses. The government experimented with policy solutions, childcare subsidies, immigration, AI-driven elder care. But the emotional core of the crisis was harder to fix. A country built on intergenerational continuity was slowly visibly losing its future. And yet, in that decline, there was a kind of beauty. In the slowing down of growth, space opened up for reflection. Shrinking towns became havens for artists. Local festivals returned. Traditional crafts were rediscovered. Young people from cities began migrating back to the countryside, not out of desperation, but out of desire. They wanted something rooted, something tactile, something that didn't involve fluorescent lights and 15-minute lunch breaks. This wasn't regression. It was realignment. Throughout all of this, Japan's global image remained strangely stable. To the outside world, it was still the land of innovation and elegance. Cherry blossoms and anime, kimonos and robots, minimalism and manners. But to those living inside Japan was something far more complex, a country constantly balancing memory and modernity, silence and self-expression, order and quiet rebellion. In a world spinning ever faster, filled with noise, division, and speed, Japan, for all its contradictions, had become something else entirely. A place that didn't pretend to have all the answers, but was still asking the right questions. What does it mean to belong? What does progress cost? Can tradition evolve? Can identity survive in a world that's always changing? These weren't just philosophical musings. They were everyday realities etched into train stations, family tables, phone screens, and alleyway shrines. Japan in the 21st century wasn't trying to be an empire. It wasn't trying to lead the world. It was trying to understand itself, and in doing so, quietly, offering something rare, a reminder that modernization doesn't have to mean erasure, and that a nation can still grow even as it slows down. As Japan moved further into the 21st century, it found itself standing at a strange crossroads, not defined by war or recovery, not by disaster or rebirth, but by a quieter, more elusive tension. After decades of breakneck transformation and spiritual recentering, Japan was no longer trying to reinvent itself. Instead, it was learning how to live with ambiguity, how to be modern without being loud, traditional, without being stuck, and globally present, without losing what made it distinct. But in this balance, a new set of challenges emerged, complex, subtle, and often invisible until you looked closely. One of the most pressing was loneliness. Statistically, Japan remains one of the safest, cleanest, most orderly nations on Earth. Its infrastructure runs on time, its cities hum with precision, and its people are generally polite, educated, and deeply conscientious. But beneath the surface, there is a growing epidemic of isolation so widespread that it now has a name: kodokushi, or lonely death. Every year, tens of thousands of elderly Japanese die alone, undiscovered for days, weeks, even months. They slip quietly out of life, often with no family, no friends, no one to notice. But it isn't just the elderly. Younger generations are feeling the same disconnect, though, in different ways. Many young adults now delay marriage indefinitely or avoid it altogether. Birth rates continue to fall. More people live alone than ever before. Work, once the central axis of identity, no longer guarantees fulfillment or even security. The promise of stability that defined post-war Japan has frayed, and with it, the clarity of roles and expectations that once guided life. Technology, while offering convenience and connection, has also complicated this picture. Japan is one of the most technologically integrated societies in the world. Cashless payments, AI assistants, robotic caretakers, and vending machines that sell everything from hot meals to fresh flowers. But in that seamless efficiency lies a paradox. As life becomes easier, human contact becomes optional. You can now go entire days in Tokyo without speaking to another person, order food on a screen check into a hotel without a front desk shop work, even receive therapy via apps. The result is a kind of curated solitude. Comfortable, but often deeply lonely. In response, new subcultures have begun to form, not around rebellion as in previous decades, but around escape. Some young people turn inward and detach, becoming hikikomori, modern hermits, who live in their rooms, often supported by aging parents. Others immerse themselves in virtual worlds, building avatars and identities that feel more authentic online than in the physical world. In Akihabara, the epicenter of otaku culture, cafes offer rented companionship. You can pay someone to smile at you, listen to you, sit beside you. It's not romance, it's relief. A way to be seen, even briefly, in a society where invisibility has become a silent epidemic. And yet Japan is not simply retreating. Even as traditional social bonds erode, new forms of community are emerging. Shared living spaces. Share houses have gained popularity among young adults seeking connection outside the family model. Urban farming projects are bringing neighbors together in rooftop gardens. Book clubs, co-working spaces, and small indie bars double as community hubs. There's a quiet movement toward intentional intimacy, not loud or dramatic, but steady and sincere. Generationally, there's also a visible shift in values. Older generations, shaped by the memory of war and the momentum of the economic miracle, continue to value stability, harmony, and duty. But younger Japanese, raised in an era of global media, climate anxiety, and economic uncertainty, often value self-expression, sustainability, and mental health. They're more likely to challenge authority, question cultural taboos, and seek therapy, something that was once nearly unthinkable in a country where emotional restraint was equated with strength. These shifts are reflected in the political sphere too. Japan remains a stable democracy, but its politics are often criticized as stagnant, with power, concentrated in the hands of older male elites. Young people vote in low numbers, not out of apathy, but out of disillusionment. They see the challenges: aging population, gender inequality, climate, vulnerability, but feel the political machinery is too slow, too rigid, too out of touch, and so change doesn't erupt in protests. It builds in lifestyle choices, quiet refusals, and creative expression. Culturally, Japan remains both grounded and expansive. Traditional arts no kabuki haiku tea ceremony still hold space in the national imagination, but now they coexist with experimental theater, electronic music, and fashion subcultures that mix punk kawaii and minimalism into something wholly original. Japan's pop culture, once seen as niche, is now a global language. Anime conventions span continents. Japanese aesthetics shape everything from architecture to UX design. And yet, in Japan itself, this cultural export is often treated with ambivalence. The country that created it doesn't always embrace it. This too is part of the paradox. Even as Japan wrestles with uncertainty, it remains deeply admired for its grace, beauty, and quiet resilience. Tourists continue to flock to Kyoto's temples, to eat ramen on street corners, to marvel at the balance between chaos and calm. But for those who live there, the questions are more intimate. How do we build meaningful lives in a society that prizes order over emotion? How do we stay connected in a culture that values privacy to the point of isolation? How do we honor the past without being trapped by it? There are no easy answers. But perhaps Japan's great strength lies not in resolution, but in its ability to live inside contradiction. To be both ancient and futuristic, both reserved and expressive, both fragile and unshakably enduring. It is a country of rituals that soothe and silences that speak, of neon-lit streets and moss-covered shrines, of elders who sweep temple courtyards at dawn, and teenagers who create entire digital worlds after midnight. In modern Japan, the future isn't rushing forward. It's unfolding slowly, thoughtfully, with both caution and care. And in that unfolding, there is space not just for innovation, but for reflection, for building not just a new society, but a more human one. As Japan continues its quiet walk through the 21st century, it does so with a distinct posture, not racing ahead, not falling behind, but leaning into uncertainty with a calm that feels both cultural and conscious. It's not apathy. It's not stagnation. It's something deeper, a national philosophy forged through centuries of upheaval, where impermanence is not feared, but accepted. And in an age where the rest of the world seems constantly chasing momentum, Japan has become something of an outlier, a country that lives in the tension between doing and being change, and continuity, memory, and motion. Nowhere is this more visible than in Japan's relationship with nature. While industrialization once distanced people from the natural world, replacing rice paddies with expressways and rivers with subway tunnels, there's been a quiet return in recent years. A growing environmental consciousness is taking hold not as a political trend, but as a cultural reawakening. Climate change is no longer an abstract global issue. Japan feels it intimately through devastating typhoons, rising sea levels along its vast coastline, unpredictable summers, and shrinking snow seasons in the north. Natural disasters, especially earthquakes, remain a constant shadow. The 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and the Fukushima nuclear disaster that followed, served as painful reminders that no amount of modernization can shield a nation from the raw force of the earth. But Japan didn't respond with panic. It responded with discipline, with silence, with solidarity. Entire towns evacuated. Families waited in orderly lines for water and food. Volunteers showed up by the thousands to help with cleanup. And perhaps most remarkably, Japan turned inward not to escape, but to listen. Artists and writers began exploring themes of fragility and restoration. Architects began rethinking urban design, not just for efficiency, but for empathy. Even in technology, the focus began shifting from spectacle to sustainability. Shinrin-yoku forest bathing became more than just a wellness trend. It became a metaphor. In a world overwhelmed by alerts, noise, and speed, Japan was choosing stillness. Walking slowly through cedar groves, listening to wind through bamboo, breathing in moss-covered silence, not as escapism, but as reconnection. A reminder that in fragility there is form, that survival doesn't always mean conquest. Sometimes it means becoming quiet enough to hear yourself again. This ethos has begun to influence other parts of daily life. The concept of motenai, a traditional expression of regret over waste, has been revived in conversations about consumption and sustainability. Young entrepreneurs are creating businesses around repair, reuse, and regional crafts. Farming cooperatives are springing up in depopulated areas, offering both food and fellowship. Even large cities are exploring how to soften their footprint: more green spaces, quieter trains, better air, more walkability. In subtle ways, Japan is not just modernizing, it is rebalancing. And that balance also extends to the digital world. While Japan remains a leader in innovation, it often adopts technology with restraint. Not every home is a smart home. Not every interaction is automated. In fact, Japan is often slower than other countries to adopt certain digital trends, not out of resistance, but out of care. There's an underlying belief that not all progress is equal, that what we gain in speed, we might lose in depth, that what we gain in efficiency, we might pay for in loneliness. So technology here doesn't aim to overwhelm. It's folded and gently woven into life, rather than imposed on it. And yet, Japan is no stranger to complexity. Beneath this surface of quiet progress, there are deep, persistent challenges. The demographic time bomb continues to tick. With more deaths than births each year and immigration still tightly controlled, the population is steadily shrinking. Entire rural towns face extinction. Schools close. Temples sit unattended. There is grief in this, the slow vanishing of Lifeway's dialects, local festivals, regional foods. But there is also adaptation. Some communities have reinvented themselves as artist retreats or ecological preserves. Others have opened their doors to foreign workers and volunteers. In doing so, they are redefining what it means to be part of a place, not by birthright, but by shared care. And this redefinition isn't just rural. In Tokyo, too, the meaning of Japanese is evolving. Second-generation immigrants, mixed-race Japanese, and returning diaspora are slowly reshaping the cultural landscape. For a historically homogeneous nation, this shift is subtle but significant. It raises new questions. Can you be Japanese if your skin is darker? If your mother is Filipino? If your name isn't written in kanji, the answers are still forming. But the conversation is happening. And that conversation itself is a sign of growth, not outward, but inward. Meanwhile, Japan's cultural exports continue to captivate the world. But there's something new in the way they are received. No longer just novelty or style. Japanese media is increasingly understood for its emotional depth. Global audiences resonate with the quiet sadness of a Studio Ghibli film, the bittersweet nostalgia of slice-of-life anime, the moral ambiguity of modern Japanese cinema. These stories, though rooted in specific soil, speak to universal human questions. How do we cope with loss? How do we find connection? What does it mean to be enough? And perhaps that's Japan's quiet gift to the world, not perfection, but presence. A way of being that honors the moment, accepts impermanence, and finds beauty not in resolution, but in form, ritual, and attention. In the West, success is often measured in loud victories. In Japan, it's often measured in silent endurance, in the ability to keep sweeping temple steps at dawn, to arrange flowers for no one, to make tea knowing it will be gone in 3 sips, to bow to the person you may never see again. This is not a utopia. Japan has its contradictions, its injustices, its shadows. But in an age of fragmentation, acceleration, and noise, its approach offers something increasingly rare. A national culture that, despite all its changes, has not forgotten how to pause, how to reflect, how to remember that meaning is not always something we build. Sometimes it's something we notice, and in that noticing, in the space between cherry blossoms falling and a train arriving on time, Japan continues to live, not as a model to follow, but as a mirror reflecting both the cost of progress and the quiet resilience of those who live in its wake. By now, Japan is no longer just responding to change, it's living within it. The pace of the world continues to accelerate, demanding louder opinions, faster decisions, more radical reinventions. But Japan, shaped by centuries of impermanence, remains committed to something subtler: continuity without resistance. It doesn't cling to the past in denial, nor does it leap into the future with reckless abandon. It moves differently, slowly, intentionally. And in doing so, it offers something almost radical in today's world: a space to breathe. As global headlines are increasingly dominated by urgency, economic collapse, political unrest, climate anxiety, Japan rarely makes the front page. Its crises tend to unfold in silence. Its revolutions, if they happen at all, are internal. But this quietness should not be mistaken for inaction. Rather, it reflects a deeply embedded cultural logic that lasting change doesn't always come through confrontation. Sometimes it arrives through adaptation, endurance, and form. You see it everywhere in the way streets are swept each morning without anyone watching, or how older shopkeepers bow and thank their last customers long after closing time. It's in the careful wrapping of a simple gift or the daily tending of a garden that no one else may ever visit. These gestures are not performative. They're not about productivity. They're about respect for the moment itself and for the relationship between people, space, and time. Japan has learned, often painfully, that permanence is an illusion. Empires collapse, cities burn, economies tumble, people vanish. What remains is ritual, memory, structure, and perhaps most importantly, attention. That's why so many aspects of Japanese culture, tea ceremony, calligraphy, archery, flower arrangement, aren't designed to be completed. They're practiced, repeated, refined. These are not hobbies. They are forms of embodied mindfulness rooted in centuries of spiritual and aesthetic philosophy, from Zen Buddhism to Shinto beliefs about animism and nature. But what's most remarkable is how this philosophy now extends into the most modern spaces. In tech offices, you'll still find workers removing their shoes before entering. In dense megacities, you'll discover hidden temples tucked behind office towers. Bullet trains arrive precisely on time, not because of obsession, but because of respect for passengers, for order, for the unspoken promise that time matters. Even as Japan digitizes and innovates, it rarely loses sight of the ethics of design, of how things feel, how they sound, how they age. And maybe that's where modern Japan distinguishes itself most, in its relationship with aging, not just of people, but of objects, institutions, and even landscapes. In the West, aging is often a problem to be solved. In Japan, it's a process to be acknowledged and honored. A weathered temple wall, a cracked ceramic bowl repaired with gold using kintsugi, an elderly chef who spent 40 years perfecting one type of soba noodle. These are not symbols of obsolescence. they are proof of care. This mindset has also shaped Japan's response to its own societal challenges. Take the aging population. Rather than resist or deny the shift Japan has, in many cases embraced it, developing entire industries around elder care, robotic companionship, accessible infrastructure, and lifelong learning. You can see elderly people practicing Tai Chi in the parks at sunrise, volunteering at community centers, or walking with children to school in bright vests as part of local safety patrols. Old age is not treated as a burden to be hidden, but as a phase to be lived actively, quietly, with grace. This same grace is also being extended cautiously, but deliberately, toward difference. Japan, once wary of multiculturalism, is gradually, almost imperceptibly, becoming more inclusive. Small but meaningful steps, a growing number of biracial and non-Japanese citizens are being seen not as outsiders, but as part of the evolving national story. More schools are adapting to linguistic diversity. More employers are recognizing international credentials. And more young Japanese are embracing cultural hybridity not as a threat to identity, but as a natural expression of a changing world. Still, this process is not without tension. Japan remains a society of high context and strong, unspoken rules. Difference is accepted slowly. Expression is often filtered. Conflict is diffused rather than confronted. But within these quiet negotiations, something profound is happening. Japan is learning to remain itself while changing, and to change without losing itself. That balance is delicate, imperfect, and often invisible to outsiders. But it's real, and perhaps that's what makes Japan so compelling, not because it offers easy models to emulate, but because it embodies the contradictions that define us all: the need to belong and the desire to be free, the hunger for progress and the ache for stability, the inevitability of loss and the insistence on beauty. In Japan, these tensions aren't resolved. They're lived, held, honored. You can feel it in the seasons. Spring is not just about cherry blossoms. It's about the knowledge that they will fall. Autumn isn't just color. It's the sound of wind through drying leaves, the smell of wood smoke, the taste of roasted chestnuts. Even death is ritualized not as an end, but as a passage. Graves are cleaned. Ancestors are remembered. Incense is lit not for gods, but for continuity. And that continuity is in the end what Japan protects most, not through force or ideology, but through attention to detail. In a restless world, it teaches us how to sit still. In a loud world, it shows the power of silence. In a disposable culture, it restores the dignity of care. Japan doesn't ask to be admired. It doesn't shout to be understood. It simply persists through earthquakes, recessions, demographic shifts, and spiritual questioning. It keeps bowing. It keeps sweeping. It keeps noticing the things most of us have forgotten how to see. And in doing so, it reminds us of something precious, that meaning isn't always found in motion achievement or reinvention. Sometimes it lives in the unspoken, in the way we treat each other, in the way we walk through the world, in the way we leave things behind, clean, complete, cared for. If Japan has taught us anything across its long, turbulent, beautiful history, it's that survival is not just about endurance. It's about transformation without erasure, about carrying forward what matters, letting go of what doesn't, and adapting with quiet dignity in a world that rarely slows down. Through war and peace, poverty and prosperity, collapse and reconstruction, Japan has never stopped evolving. And yet somehow, it has never let go of itself. It's easy to reduce a country to a timeline, a list of wars and treaties, economic shifts, and social trends. But Japan resists reduction. It doesn't unfold like a linear story. It loops, spirals, reflects. Its present is layered with its past. Its future arrives not with a bang, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, you hear centuries of tension held in careful balance. Even now, as the 21st century pushes forward, Japan walks a path all its own. It's not racing to lead the world. It's not trying to define it either. Instead, it's offering something else, something increasingly rare. A blueprint for how to persist without noise, how to modernize without forgetting, and how to meet uncertainty with ritual patience and grace. You see it in the smallest things. A train station worker who bows to an empty platform. A store clerk who wraps a purchase with geometric precision, not because it's expected, but because it's right. An elderly woman sweeping the steps of a shrine each morning as she has for decades, though she never asks if anyone notices. A child helping to carry groceries for a neighbor because it's simply part of being human. These are not grand gestures. They are the architecture of continuity, the invisible beams that hold a culture in place. Japan does not pretend to be perfect. Its contradictions are many. It is aging, shrinking, and still navigating deeply rooted gender roles and cultural conservatism. Its silence at times can conceal harm. Its reverence for order can suppress dissent. But within those imperfections lies the country's most powerful quality, its honesty with complexity. It doesn't rush to solve itself. It listens, it absorbs, it adjusts, slowly, carefully, purposefully. In a time when so many nations define themselves by expansion, by more land, more wealth, more influence, Japan has done something radically different. It has focused inward, on craft, on ritual, on refinement. It has cultivated a culture not of dominance, but of depth. And that depth has become its legacy. This isn't just about heritage sites or traditional arts. It's about mindset. It's about the belief that even in decline, there is beauty. That even in loss, there is form. That even in endings, there is opportunity to start again differently, but with care. And so, as the world watches Japan, often with curiosity, sometimes with confusion, it might be time to reconsider what we're looking for. Japan is not a mystery to be solved. It's not a museum to be preserved. It's a mirror reflecting back the choices we all must make in uncertain times. Will we rush forward, consuming and discarding? Or will we move more slowly, protecting what matters? Will we define progress by size and speed, or by harmony, sustainability, and stillness? Because what Japan models isn't just a national identity, it's a philosophy, a way of being in the world that doesn't deny pain, but integrates it, that doesn't ignore impermanence, but celebrates it, that doesn't fear the quiet, but embraces it as a kind of truth. Perhaps that's why Japanese culture resonates so deeply around the world today, not just through anime or design or cuisine, but through its sense of emotional authenticity. In a world that often feels fragmented and performative, Japan offers us a narrative that is contemplative, human, and beautifully unresolved. It reminds us that it's okay not to have all the answers, that it's okay to move at your own pace, that healing can take generations, that growth doesn't always look like upward curves or public declarations. Sometimes it looks like a man tending bonsai trees for 50 years. Sometimes it looks like a grandmother quietly teaching her granddaughter how to fold paper cranes. Sometimes it looks like a city rebuilding itself, not bigger, but wiser. So if you've followed this journey from feudal swords to silent subways, from firebombs to flower petals, from imperial ambition to introspective design, you've seen something few places can offer. A full arc of human complexity lived out across centuries, across generations, across the delicate weave of memory and imagination. And yet, even after all this, Japan isn't done. Not because it seeks more, but because life here is understood not as a destination, but as a practice, something you return to each day, with humility, with care, with the knowledge that everything, every breath, every season, every era is temporary and therefore precious. In that spirit, the story of Japan doesn't end. It simply continues, silently, attentively, like the sound of wind through bamboo or the slow drip of water in a temple garden, always present, always moving, always reminding us that in a world so often defined by urgency, there is another way to exist. A way that bows, that listens, that remembers, and that endures.